Here's another text effect that can be very, very cool. This is the shadow effect. This is different than a drop shadow. So let's go ahead and call this shadow effect. And let's do a width of 1920, a height of 1080. We're going to select white background content this time. And I think we'll leave everything else alone. So to start, I'm going to go ahead and put the text that I want to shadow right in the middle of the page. I'm going to write about there. And I'm going to create a text box. And I'm just going to do this with my name. This also works best with a nice thick font. I'm using Acumen Pro Wide. All right, there we go. Just the size of our text box a little bit. And let's see if we can get this right there, kind of on the middle. That red line indicates our actual middle point. All right, so we've got the name on there. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this layer that's got the text on it. So I'm going to drag down from the layer to the new layer button. You'll see we get Mark Lassoff copy. The reason you don't see anything is one layer is exactly on top of the other. But if I use the move tool and drag that layer off, you can see we've got two identical copies of the same layer. I'm going to hit Control T. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the layer upside down. I'm going to hold the Shift key when I do this to make it easier to get us exactly at 180 degrees. Now, next, I'm actually going to inverse it. And what that means is instead of starting from what's the left-hand side, we're going to start on the right-hand side. And I'm going to kind of match it up just like this. So I want the letters to be actually right underneath the original letters. Not too bad. Can nudge a little bit with the arrow keys. And when I'm done, I want to be just as precise as I can. So there you go. So now we've got a reflection. Now there's a couple of things I want to do with the reflection to sell it. First of all, the reflection is way too dark. So with the reflected layer showing, let's set the opacity down to, I'm going to go down to about 30%. You don't have to be precise here. You can do whatever looks good to you. And then I want to warp this just a little bit. So I'm going to hit Control T once again. And if you hold Control and if you hold Control and Shift at the same time and point just a little bit outside the bounding box, you can drag left or right and warp the text just a little bit. So we're going to warp just a little bit like that. Press Enter. All right, so that's looking pretty good, but it's still a little too sharp. So I think what I'm going to do is use a blur effect to blur that shadow a little bit. So with the shadow layer selected, let's go to Filter, Blur, and I like using the Gaussian blur tool. Now, in order to do that, we've got to make that into a smart object or rasterize it. Let's go ahead and rasterize it. And that's way too much, so we can adjust the slider here till it looks about right. And there we go. So there, in several short steps, we've got a really interesting reflection effect for our text.